Somalië.
50,000 people died in Hargeisa city alone. 250,000 were killed during the civil war. And 1 million of our people sought refuge in neighboring countries, Ethiopia, Yemen, Djibouti. That was the army fighting the civilians who had paid taxes to support the army. So the civilians were actually paying for the guns and the ammunition that was used against them. If that's not genocide, I don't know what is.
Voor de burgeroorlog woonden in Hargeisa 500.000 mensen. Bij de gevechten in mei 88 vielen er meer dan 60.000 doden. De rest van de bevolking sloeg op de vlucht.
There was much dead body, much dead body. So we burying that dead body at the night time, because in the daylight we are afraid of the bombing and killing. In the night times, all the night times we are burying on the dead body and getting some water and some fruit all the night times. All the day times we are just laying on for bombing of air attack and heavy artillery.
meel bakhaaraho bayca mushtara ayaan ugu fadhiyay halkiibaa maalinimadina laga dareeray iyo hubkii waaweyaan.
This woman was a shop owner. She was a businesswoman. I think
lagu garaacay gurigii ayaa markaa lagu xareeyay 3 cisho ayaan markaa gurigii ku jiray iyo raashinkii aanu dhimanay ay naga boobeen.
They looted the food rations that the civilians had in their homes. They were surrounded and kept indoors for 3 days without food, without water.
kolkii aan markii dooxay ka soo talawnay ayaan meydad aad badan aan ugu imi oo rasaastina si xoog ah u socoto oo la horanayo abaarta ninaan walaalanahay oo markaa ila socdo oo yar wareersan oo isna suuqa ka soo qabtay halkii ku dilay.
When this abundance continued, we decided to go through Ethiopia, this nearest border we can reach. In this case, we started to walk on foot, and it takes for us about 12 days. On the road, you will always see the people, the elders, the children, women, all just running each other on the road. And that's to the border.
That's a refugee camp that housed 1 million refugees. There was Dur'ad, there was Qaho, and there was, where was the other one? Darhor, Abokar. There were 4 or 5 refugee camps, each with over 100,000 refugees.
De Ogaden-woestijn in het oosten van Ethiopië. Een van de meest onherbergzame gebieden van het land. In juni 88 kwamen hier in een paar dagen tijd bijna 500.000 vluchtelingen aan. De oorlog in Somalië bleef in het wereldnieuws maanden onopgemerkt. Dat duurde dan ook lang voordat de hulpverlening hier op gang kwam. Het Hoge Commissariaat voor de Vluchtelingen stond voor de bijna hopeloze taak om in deze woestijn de vluchtelingen in leven te houden. Hargeisa was voor de oorlog een welvarende stad. De vluchtelingen die hier vandaan kwamen zijn dan ook goed opgeleide vaklui, handelaren en intellectuelen. Zonder enige noemenswaardige bezittingen moesten ze van de ene op de andere dag wennen aan een vluchtelingenbestaan.
This is my family. This is my children, the wife, the sister of the wife, and my children. Some of them are not here. And this is the tents I live with my boys. And this is the kitchen we cook. That's the kitchens of the family. And we also, this is the tent of the ladies and wives also sleep. And that's the present situation we live here. That's it.
De Somalische vluchtelingen zijn eigenlijk nooit nieuws geweest. Ruim 3 jaar zitten ze nu al in dit kamp. Nog dagelijks komen er nieuwe bij. Vooral uit het zuiden van Somalië, waar troepen van de gevallen president Baar oorlog voeren met de nieuwe machthebbers. Iedereen moet zich in het kamp laten registreren. Alleen dan heb je recht op gerantsoeneerd voedsel.
When we become a refugee camp, especially in the Hashins, it's very strange for us. And it's like this. It's very strange. Thousands of people who was self-esteemed and blind, waiting something to do. And there is no water, there is no home, there is no anything. There's no tent, there's no home. There's no water, and I felt very strange and wonder. It happens. It is like this on my age. I don't expect it on this day. And it's still very difficult for us, and we wonder. And it is. I told myself it's better to believe. That will is better. That is what I told my life on this situation.
Ibrahim was in Hargeisa een succesvol man. Als manager van de luchthaven had hij een goed salaris, bedienden en een groot eigen huis. De verwoesting van de stad verraste ook hem en zijn gezin volledig.
aad bay dowrka u dhiman u shaqaysan jiray oo raaxaysan jiray markuu aan baryo uu tuga dowr aad bay dowrka badan markaa noloshii dowran ku noolaan jirnay iyo nolosheen kasku mid maha weyn bay u dhexeeyay qof shaqaystay oo nolol wanaagsan kusoo noolaa markuu dee la kulmo baryo nusqaan iyo dhibaatooyin.
We lived a life where we earned a living when we had comfort. And it's strange for us to be somewhere where we have no food, no water, and we just don't know what to do.
waxaan dareemayaa dadku markii hore aan gacanta ku hayay dad wax baray oo tacliin bartay oo kaxayay oo nidaam leh oo fiican bay ahaayeen intii aan dibadda usoo baxnay dadkii waxay noqdeen wax qaarkood way ku dhaqaaqeen markii hore noloshina aad u daciiftay.
My children have been attending school. Since we became refugees, the character of my children have changed. They have become rebellious, and they have resorted to petty crime.
sharaftii aad u daciifay ruuxdoodii aad u daciifay waxbarashadoodii aanay jirin wax ciidanka kolkii dambe ku fiireen wada dhibaatooyin badan ayaa korintoodii dambe 3 sannadood la qabsatay. hoy la-aan waxyaabo badan ayaa 3 sannadood dhibaato xoog leh soo qabsatay hayntoodii.
graves.
Sinds 2 jaar heeft Ibrahim weer een baan. In het kamp is hij op vrijwillige basis een soort gezondheidswerker. Hij is verantwoordelijk voor de juiste uitvoering van de talrijke begrafenissen. En verder moet hij bij zijn dagelijkse rondje in het kamp nieuwe ziektegevallen opsporen en registreren.
The feeling of my work, whenever we saw somebody who needed assistance, and we could not do anything for that, he becomes angry and hopeless. These dead body, most of them, some of them dying for dehydration, and some of them is dying for, especially for children, they are dying for diarrhea, measles, and so on. So there's no vaccine for them most of the times. Sometimes you got some, but most of the time there's no vaccine. So you can see that most of the people is dying without assistance or without supply for themselves.
iyada hadda nafta ku ilaaliyo inta maaragtay isbedel kale uu haddana dee dhacayo mooyaane wax kala xarakaada ku qabanaa ma jirto. waxay ku xidhan tahay miina maalintii kushinaya miina ku xidhan hada waxay soo gooyeen oo dhanka miina ku xidhan inta dambena miinada inay la kahay waa markay xasooda goysanayeen waa arkeen markay goynayo كوالدنا هاي سكرة هي قراءة كم قرن خصوصا دي قراءة أيوة كل وين كل سحية.
When they returned to their houses, they found their dwellings littered with landmines, because many of the houses had been looted. The army took corrugated iron roofs, the windows, the doors, and then left landmines behind to blow up on the civilians if and when they would return to the cities. But my father's house had 7 landmines in it when we returned to it. I can speak for one house, 7 landmines.
نرجع السوق معين كسر مقنعه كلام نشاط معين كسر مقنعه عادي جالس سنانه أقل كان كهدرة مالي يدوش بس ولا كهدرة يدوش حتى بس ولا على مسؤول حوالي ما في طيارات هي حتى كل شيء كان فوقنا كسر كان الله يتكلم كذي ما قرر مش عقول هي كانت مثلا دوبته
This is my house. This is the bedroom, second room here. This is the bedroom and the toilet. Bedroom and toilet here. Right.
When the civilians returned to
That's room on this side.
after liberation. And what they found was 95% of the city was leveled to the ground. The streets were littered with dead corpses and human remains. And one of the things that was most noticeable was the number of dogs, because dogs had been living on the human carcasses. And they had never seen that many dogs living in the streets before in the city. That's the human carnage that took place. And the airplanes that caused the bombings took off from the airport of Hargeisa. It's as if planes took off from the airport in Brussels only to bomb the city of Brussels. They were referred to as 4-minute sorties. It would take 4 minutes for the plane to take off, empty its holds on the city, and land again. That's how close the target was. And for every sortie, the captains of those MiG fighters were paid $4,000. So the more sorties you made, the more $4,000 you earned, and the more civilians you killed. Civilians who paid for your salary, who paid for the bombs, who paid for the army.
Such things happen from the humans. Very, very sorrowful. Mankind cannot be thinking about such destruction like this. The fighting can be happening, but such destruction of the city, never thinks. Nobody can think such things happen. The present situation is difficult to bear and think, because we are in survival living only. Never thinking how to bear this now, but how to survive itself.
Ibrahim is geen uitzondering. Hij en de andere teruggekeerde vluchtelingen staan voor de bijna onmogelijke taak hun huizen en stad weer op te bouwen. Ze voelen zich vergeten. De wereld is nauwelijks geïnteresseerd in dit deel van de wereld. Honderdduizenden verkiezen daarom nog steeds een verblijf in een vluchtelingenkamp, midden in de woestijn van Ethiopië. Daar is tenminste nog voedsel en water. Bovendien heeft het leger van het vorige regime in deze stad nog zo'n 500.000 mijnen neergelegd. Maar toch zijn er 100.000 mensen teruggekeerd. Met een paar golfplaten of een uit het vluchtelingenkamp meegebrachte tent woont men op de plek waar ooit een woning stond. 2 dagen na hun aankomst had ook het gezin van Ibrahim in een van de vroegere kamers een onderkomen gevonden.
Why Europe, America, Canada, and every country in the world received large influxes of refugees. There were waves and waves of refugees from Somaliland that came to your shores, and you gave them shelter. You protected them from their own soldiers. You gave them food. You gave education to their children. Scandinavian countries, Britain, Canada, US, Arab countries, Arab Gulf countries, they ran from their own soldiers to you for shelter. And today the wave of Somalis who come to you come from Somalia, because most Somalilanders have returned home. We are all returnees, the ministers and myself. We're all refugees who have returned from the world, from anywhere, from elsewhere, to go back to Somaliland to rebuild Somaliland. The waves of Somalis that you receive today are from Italian Somalia, La Somalia Italiana. And if peace should not return to the Horn of Africa, and heaven forbid, should there be a war again between Somaliland and Somalia, you would receive more waves and waves of refugees coming from the Horn of Africa. And that's what we want to prevent. We want our people to return, who have returned to that country, Somaliland, to remain in that country, to take part in the reconstruction, to rebuild the country and show the world what Somalilands are made of. Somaliland today is a country where we have more children going to school. We have more schools, we have more hospitals, we have better roads, we have better businesses, we have better functioning airports than we ever had when we had a temporary union with La Somalia Italiana. Thank you very much.
The Federation of Somalia. Before that, incredibly, Somaliland was the 12th former British colony on the continent of Africa to receive our independence. Now Somaliland seeks our independence once more. I'm going to move. Are you speaking next? Yeah, okay. I'm going to move over to Michael Greaves, who's really going to put on his barrister's wig and speak very much about the legal case, the very legal case and the strong legal arguments for recognition of Somaliland. So, Michael, without further ado. Okay.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. There are very few bits of the earth left today that are not part of a country which has full international recognition, a seat at the United Nations and all that goes with the status of being a recognised state. Yet, right in the middle of one of the most strategically important regions on this planet sits this small country, Somaliland. And its importance is clear, given only a very quick glance at the map. It lies just to the north of its erstwhile partner in the failed union with Somalia. And we know quite a lot about that country. It's a country which Somalia has not functioned for the last 25 years as a state, but has been a state ruled by warlords and radical Islamists of al-Shabaab, and the home to gangs of pirates that have played havoc with the passage of shipping along the Horn of Africa and down the east coast of the continent of Africa. On the other side of the water lies Yemen, and between the respective coasts of Yemen and Somaliland pass pretty much all the sea traffic using the vital Suez Canal route that runs between Southeast Asia and Australasia on the one hand, and Europe and the east coast of the United States on the other. And 10% of that traffic can't use the Suez Canal because it's too big, so it has to go down the east coast of Africa and round the Cape route. It doesn't take much of a genius to realise just how vital those waters are to the interests of the whole world. Not very far away is the Persian Gulf, and the importance of that seaway, again, needs no stressing by me. We all know exactly what it means to the west. It's a vital region. Yet, since the dissolution of the union with Somalia, Somaliland has remained hitherto completely unrecognised by the entire world. So, I want to just take a quick look at three things. Firstly, a little bit of history, then the issues, the legal issues that surround it, and then briefly look at the issue of recognition as it stands today. Somaliland came under British protection, and I'm going to start, and Somalilanders will forgive me for starting with the arrival of the British on the scene, because that's the best place to start. Established a protectorate in 1888, and it was garrisoned from Aden on the other side of the water, and was effectively administered as part of British India, remarkably, until 1898, and then in due course became under the aegis of the Colonial Office. 1940, the Italians invade British Somaliland, and it's the only campaign in which the Italians were victorious in World War II, overrunning the protectorate in August 1940, annexing it to their empire. It was recovered by British forces in March 1941, and then was returned to British rule. After the end of the Second World War, it became obvious that British Somaliland, like all other African colonies and protectorates, would become independent sooner rather than later. And so the next 15 years were spent in preparation for that moment. One aspect of that which is particularly germane to this issue, it comes from the archives of the British government. A lot of the work that was being done by the Colonial Office at that time, between 1945 and 1960, details discussions and agreements between the UK on the one hand and the neighbouring states, Ethiopia, which was independent, France and Italy, which were the colonial powers for Djibouti on the north and Somalia on the south. Many of those discussions were designed to fix the international borders of Somaliland, and you can see by going through the archive the process by which gradually agreements are made over individual bits of land, so that by the time the moment for independence comes up, there is full agreement as to what the future borders of Somaliland and indeed of Somalia were going to be. It is well understood that in due course, when independence came for Somaliland, that there was a desire to have a union with all Somaliland, or all Somali nations, and in particular that it would seek union with Italian Somaliland when it in turn became independent. The UK archives again are revealing Some show that the UK was happy to encourage this union to take place, but there is something of a thread in the archives of warnings being given that some thought ought to be given as to whether this really was such a good idea after all. Notwithstanding that, events came to a climax. On the 26th of June, British Somaliland became independent as an international state. And no less than 35 other states in the world immediately signified their recognition of that fact, their recognition of the government of Somaliland as both the de facto and de jure government of a new state. And implicit in that recognition, and this is very important, they were accepting that Somaliland had the borders that had been agreed internationally. What then happens, and we can describe this in hindsight as something of a legal and political shambles, was the creation of the union with Somalia. I'm going to go into some detail, and I'm sorry if it's a little bit boring, but one would strive manfully to avoid detail, but it's quite crucial to the legal case that Somaliland has. It had been agreed in advance between representatives of both Somaliland and Somalia that there would be in due course an act of union, and that it would be signed by both states upon independence, and that that document would be in the nature of an international agreement between two states. The Legislative Assembly of Somaliland thus passed its own Union of Somaliland and Somalia law immediately upon independence on the 27th of June 1960. And in theory it was immediately effective in Somaliland. But it was anticipated that that document would also be signed by representatives of Somalia. In fact, that never happened, because the Legislative Assembly of Somalia met on the 30th of June, a day before its own independence, in order to consider what it was going to do. That body decided to approve in principle a completely different document in Italian, Atto di Unione, which was significantly different from the document that the Somalilanders had produced and passed in their legislative assembly. This new document requested the government of Somalia to establish with the government of Somaliland a definitive single text of the Act of Union to be submitted in due course to the National Assembly, that's of the new state, the new union, for approval. That is important because it suggests that both the Assembly and Somalia did not regard the Atto di Unione as being binding on Somaliland. It's difficult for us 50 years on to recall the enthusiasm and exuberance which predominated events surrounding independence in Africa in the early 60s. They were heady days as old colonies emerged from their chrysalis as bright new butterflies every few months. So what then happened may be seen perhaps as practical politics taking over and law and so on getting swallowed up in idealistic enthusiasm. On the 1st of July, the members of the Somaliland Legislative Assembly and its Somalia equivalent met in a joint session, and a constitution which had been drafted in Somalia was accepted on the basis of acclamation, and the provisional president was elected. That was in pursuit of the draft constitution which required such a thing to happen. Almost the first thing this new elected provisional president did was issue a decree to formalise the union. In the event, that decree was never converted into law as it was required to do. If a decree was not passed into law, it in theory ceased to have effect from ab initio, in other words, from the date of issue. So that any decree, a particular decree declaring a union, would have been void from the word go. So there's a very strong argument for saying the act of formalisation of the union was thus void. The other problem is that at this stage, as you will see, there's more than one version of a document floating around purporting to be an act of union. And any good lawyer will tell you that where there's a contract, if the terms of it must be broadly identical, at least in substance, if not in fact, or there's no contract. So there's a very, very strong case for asserting that the union of Somaliland and Somalia law had no legal validity in the South Somalia, and the approval in principle of the Atto di Unione was insufficient to make it legally binding in that territory. So what you have is two documents, neither of which are identical in terms, but which eventually get subsumed in the enthusiasm for political union, and that's what it comes to at the end of the day. So The next step was in January 1961, when a new Act of Union, a totally new document, was then put to the National Assembly of what by now had become the Union Parliament of the Republic of Somalia. And that was passed on 31st of January 1961. It was made retrospective, and any lawyer will tell you that it's a fundamental principle that when you can't make laws retrospective in their application. So there are a whole series of jolly good reasons why the whole legal process was completely flawed. None of these documents was the same. And again, the same point about having contracts that match each other in their substantive details applies. The next event that then happens is that there is a referendum in the new country. And this was designed to confirm what had taken place. It was a very interesting exercise. In the former British Somaliland, 4 out of 6 electoral districts, and those held the clear majority of its population, voted to reject the new constitution, and the no vote there ranged between 60 and 72%. In Somalia, that is the former Italian Somaliland, with the exception of one district, there was a yes vote was registered, and here it ranged between 88% and 100%. Call me cynical if you like. There are some special circumstances, such as the referendum in Gibraltar and the Falkland Islands, where 98.97% of the voters have voted in favour of maintaining the status quo. But most of us in this room, I suspect, would be very incredulous of votes in the high 90s as being honest votes. So returning to, if one comes back to the plebiscite, some of the evidence available relating to electoral districts in Somalia, the Italian Somaliland, is demonstrated by one area which had a 100% yes vote. At the end of the day, Somalilanders, I think, can be forgiven for thinking that the vote in the former Italian Somaliland was bogus and had been procured by fraud and dishonesty. So at the end of this, we have a position where a union has been produced. None of the documents which purport to create that union are the same. And there is no legal document which you can actually sit down and say was approved as an act of union. We move on swiftly. In the late 1960s, a man called Siad Barre conducted a coup, and eventually in 1979 overthrew the original constitution of Somalia. A referendum was held to approve a new constitution in the late 1970s, and by the end of the 1980s, the situation in Somalia had become such that his position had become extremely precarious, particularly in Somaliland itself. His response was to conduct, as you've seen from the film, a bloody, and we can now think of it as largely criminal campaign in the sense of international criminal law, a campaign against Somaliland. It was associated particularly with him and led by his brother, his son-in-law, Mohammed Said Hersi Morgan. He was the gentleman who wrote an infamous letter and report to his father-in-law. The detail of it is not important, but in that document he set out essentially what he says was a plan for the obliteration of political, military and community leadership of the people of Somaliland. There is a word for such a plan in international criminal law now in the light of jurisprudence of the Yugoslavia Tribunal, and I don't want to be inflammatory, but the word is genocide. When you seek to kill the political leadership of a group of people, that is what it is. And in pursuit of that plan, you've seen the pictures, Somaliland cities and towns were indiscriminately attacked, leaving many hundreds of thousands dead, wounded, displaced, mutilated and homeless. It was a campaign that was counterproductive because in 1991 Somaliland's political leadership decided to tell the world, we've had enough of this, we are going to resume our independence. And In the 23 years since then, Somaliland has done everything it conceivably can, and which might reasonably have been expected of it, to demonstrate that it is a state and that it's acting as a responsible member of the world community. The response of the world has been essentially to ignore Somaliland. Somaliland is a state, as a matter of fact and law. There's a very good reason for it. It qualifies in any legal definition of what is a state. It doesn't need a referendum to confirm that status, but I'm sure that were they to hold a referendum, there would be a substantial vote in favour of saying, we are a state, we are independent. The answer to statehood is actually quite straightforward. The classic statement of statehood goes back to a convention signed by South American states in 1933, the Montevideo Convention on the Rights and Duties of States, which sets out in Article 1 what everybody now accepts to be a proper statement of what a state is. Article 1 requires that a state should possess 4 things. 1, a permanent population, 2, a defined territory, 3, a government, and 4, the capacity to enter into relations with other states. The European Union, interestingly, has endorsed that as an accurate statement of the law. When in the 1990s the Balkan states flew off from the centrifuge which was Yugoslavia, the question arose as to what the status of all the various new entities which had emerged was. In particular, Serbia-Montenegro, as it then was trying to assert that it was the successor state to the former Yugoslavia, not a new state, which would have given it significant advantages in the world as it sought to take its place. In the event, the European Union established a commission to deal with the issues, and it was called the Badanter Arbitration Committee, set up by the European community in August 1991 to provide advice on the legal issues that had arisen as a result of the breakup of Yugoslavia. It went on to hand down a number of opinions on the major legal questions. But in respect of this particular issue, and it's one of the most important opinions that it delivered, was to accept the Montevideo Convention as being an accurate proposition as to what makes a state. Somaliland plainly can satisfy all of the conditions. We're able to say, because of the agreements that were made internationally before independence, what the territory of Somaliland is. It is that which was recognised by 35 countries in June 1960, when for 5 days Somaliland existed as an independent state. Those borders were set and agreed, and there can be no question about them. Secondly, within those borders, there is a settled and identifiable population. It's a population that's been there thousands of years. They live, work, and have their being in Somaliland, and it is plainly a permanent population. Thirdly, there is clearly a government in Somaliland, and I only need to look around the room and point out to you the representatives of that government, who function and act exactly as you would expect a government to do. The finances are managed, the economy is managed, the physical infrastructure of the country is attended to, the legal infrastructure is attended to, and there are all sorts of other indications that what you have here is a state which has a government. There are courts, there's a legal system, there's a parliament, a police force, and a modest military force. There's a civil service, and its people look to the government for all the things that people normally do. And indeed, one might make the proposition that there is more of a government in Somaliland than there is, because in the Palestinian question there's some doubt as to exactly how the government is formed. There's more of a government in Somaliland than there is in Palestine, which seems to be at the moment getting recognition all around the world. Finally, it has control of its foreign relations. It can and does enter into relations with foreign governments. It deals with its neighbours. Whilst they may not recognise Somaliland officially, foreign governments certainly do business with it. And tomorrow, if a recognition came, the foreign minister would be out making agreements with his neighbours very promptly, I suspect. So the capacity is there. There is also the issue, and this is something that Jim Carver touched on earlier, the issue of self-determination, which needs to be put into the equation. The theory of self-determination goes back really to the United Nations Charter back in, which was when the United Nations was formed in 1945. But you may recall that in 1960, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution. It was designed to call upon, effectively, all owners of empires to get rid of their colonies as soon as possible. And much of the resolution deals with that issue. Now, Somaliland is not a colony, and was not a colony. It was an independent country in 1960. And there is Article 2 of the Declaration on Self-Determination that is clearly of general and continuing application to Somaliland. And it reads as follows: all peoples have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. I've already identified for you the fact that Somaliland has a population which is permanent. Those people are entitled to exercise the right to self-determination. They're entitled to decide for themselves how and by whom they're governed, and how the country in which they live should be structured politically, economically, and culturally. They have the right to pursue their economic, social, and cultural development, in the words of the resolution. And the refusal of states to recognise the status of Somaliland is, many may conclude, a denial of that right. Well, that's the law. The bottom line is this. Somaliland, as it stands today, is a state for the purposes of international law. Of that, I believe, there can be no doubt. Recognition, on the other hand, is a completely different thing. Recognition is a political act. And the EU Commission that I referred to earlier, the Baarlamanka Commission, made that point exactly. Statehood doesn't depend on recognition in law, but politically it plainly does. There are some very interesting aspects to the recognition question. These are not the only ones, there are many others. But the first is this. Amongst African nations there has been qualified support for Somaliland, and when conversations have been taking place, people seem to support the aspect, the idea of recognition. But there is one particular spanner which tends to get thrown into the apple cart. One of the guiding principles of the African Union in terms of African solidarity is that there should be no recognition of international borders being changed, those international borders which were established at the end of the colonial period. Now, there's a perfectly good reason for that. Some of the colonial borders that were drawn didn't correspond with former historical realities, but nobody wanted to open up the Pandora's box of approving secessionist movements such as the one that arose in Biafra, because that would have caused all sorts of people to start saying, oh, well, we want our little bit of our country to be a new country. That, of course, has rather gone by the board, because you now have the example of Sudan and South Sudan, and everybody has accepted that that particular division has both taken place and is a legal division, and South Sudan has become an internationally recognised country. So, at a stroke, the principle of not mucking about with the former borders of countries has rather gone by the board. But the second point is that this is not a case of some secessionist movement seeking to change the borders. This is merely a return to the status ante quo, in other words, the period of 5 days recognition, in which Somaliland had a quite separate existence. In that sense, the Somaliland question is completely unique on the continent of Africa. There is nothing quite like it. This is not a case of secession. This is not a case like a Biafra. It's not a case it's not a case like Biafra. It is completely like the United Arab Republic, which some of you may remember existed between 1957 and 1961. Egypt and Syria went into a union, and then 4 or 5 years later they decided they didn't like it, and they ended the union. That is the case for Somaliland. It entered a union, it decided that it did not want to remain in the union, and has left. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the vital thing. This is not about meddling with colonial borders. This is about a marriage which has failed, and that a divorce has to take place. One of the important things about getting recognition for Somaliland is, as I pointed out earlier, is its strategic position on the Horn of Africa. At the moment, Somaliland cannot advance in any sense at all. It finds it difficult to operate in the normal world. Getting development aid, getting loans, functioning as a state, it can't do any of those things. And whilst that happens, its economy can't advance, and it cannot develop its infrastructure and as a nation as everybody else does. Events in Europe in recent weeks remind us of the dangers of radical Islam, dangers that are very real for all of us. Yet here on the Horn of Africa, there is a moderate Muslim state that's done all, that to all intents and purposes has behaved impeccably since 1991, when it restored its independence. It's not being allowed to develop economically, it's not being able to develop. And so it's effectively being left to moulder on the corner of Africa. The danger is that if we don't give its people the chance of progressing economically, if we deny them, continue to deny them the ability and means to develop, there is every risk that young men, firstly, young men and young women will leave the country, and it will be deprived of some of its talent. Others will then drift off to criminal gangs, and we know only too well that criminal gangs eventually get exploited by the radicals. On the other hand, Somaliland has so much to offer, and I was able with Jim Carver to go to a development conference last year, and I think both of us were absolutely staggered by the number of people who were interested players in the world of mining, oil and commerce, who wanted to find out about Somaliland and see if there was business to be done. And there are all sorts of possibilities. There are minerals, there's possibly oil, there are agricultural and horticultural possibilities. There is a potential tourist business industry. There is a major port at Berbera, which could be turned into an enormous hub for the import and export of goods into and out of neighbouring countries. Yet, there is a problem. Until you recognise Somaliland, almost none of this can happen. There are some courageous souls who are already doing business, but by and large people say, yes, but you're not recognised as a country, and therefore we don't have the courage to come in and help. There is also the prospect, we know about piracy, but we also know that this is, as I've described it earlier, one of the most important bits of sea in the world. Here is an enormous port at Berbera, which, if there were difficulties in the area, could be used by naval forces from NATO to help protect shipping. If it falls into the hands of the wrong people, that port doesn't become available. Just to give you one example of the absurdity of the approach that some governments take, our own Foreign Office in the United Kingdom refuses to recognise Somaliland. It does so because the African, and this was stated by the ambassador to Ethiopia at the conference last year, it does so because it wishes to allow the African Union to make the first move. And effectively what is being said is we will allow the African Union to determine British foreign policy. Well, there it is, ladies and gentlemen. There are enormously good reasons why recognition should take place. I think it is an unassailable case. and many of us feel the time has come to end such games.
Thank you, Michael, for such a sound opinion, legal opinion. One thing we find increasingly in European Parliament in Strasbourg in the plenary sessions speaking about is the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. And I feel, as Michael underlined in his earlier points, a strong Somaliland, which of course is a moderate Sunni Muslim country. It is a huge, huge opportunity for moderate Sunni Islam to lead the way. Edna spoke of the good educational facilities across Somaliland, and it strikes me that a well-educated youth who don't have the ability to fulfil their true potential, which I don't feel they do currently, with the lack of recognition of Somaliland, can often transfer, as Michael indicated, into other negative areas. So, for the very real security reasons in itself, that in itself is a very strong case, aside of the obvious and definite legal argument that was just put across so transparently by Michael. Now, I'd like to invite Mohammed Dar to come up. Mohammed is the Somaliland's representative in Brussels, and I feel that it's only right that Mohammed should come up and introduce the Foreign Minister who will give his keynote speech. So, Matt, would you like to?
Yes. Good morning. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. And first of all, I would like to introduce Mr. Mohammed Bihi Yunis, the Foreign Minister and International Cooperation of Somaliland. Secondly, I would like to introduce Dr. Saad Shire, who is the Minister of Planning of Somaliland. And of course, Madam Edna, whom you know very well, and the former Foreign Minister of Somaliland, and now the President of the hospital in Hargeisa, as well as also Mr. Abdelkader, who is a hotelier, a big man in Somaliland, Mr. Ali, the representative of Somaliland to the UK, and of course all the other staff members who are taking part in this function. I don't have much to say, and I'm sorry, I made an omission. Mrs. Mademoiselle Nim'o Ilmi, who is an advisor to the minister, legal advisor to the minister. First of all, I want to thank all of you for the organization of this event, and particularly to Honorable Jim Carver and Mr. Honorable Nigel Farage, the President of the UKIP, the UK Independent Party, to which we are very grateful. And also other participants, as I said, the honorable parliamentarians, the senior officials, the representative of the media. This is also welcomed, I would say, largely and enthusiastically by the Somaliland communities, not only in Belgium and Holland, but in the UK, in the United States of America, and in Canada, in Australia, where we have a huge number of people who left Somaliland some years ago. The idea and the our case has been well presented by Michael Grievous, the lawyer. I don't have much to say that much. Later on, you will hear a statement, from the Foreign Minister, Mr. Bihi, and also sometime in the afternoon, Dr. Saad Shire, on the development process which is taking place, in Somaliland. As a representative of Somaliland, I think I have the privilege, to work closely with some of the members of Parliament in Brussels, some British parliamentarians like Dr. Tannock, other honorable members of parliament, and of course those who come to know about the matter about Somaliland, support Somaliland strongly. The reason being, as has been explained amply, that how people have recovered from this carnage. It was a wasteland, to use the expression of Eliot, the American poet. It was a wasteland after the war. I went there, I remember in 1991, Hargeisa, which has now a population of nearly 1 million people, had at that time 2,000 individuals. All the people deserted the area and went and took refuge in Ethiopia. But now you would see how the people have rebuilt the country. And I think one thing which is very, which strikes us, even Somalilanders and other Somalis, the decision of the former government, that dictatorial government, not only to fight against the political movements, but to start killing the civilian population, without considering whether these people were civilians, whether they were political parties and whatnot. So I think here you have a strong feeling of the people of Somaliland to control even our government. It's a participatory government. People take part in the decision-making process, not only through the parliament and the House of Representatives, elders, but really you will see how much they're much involved. A British writer was writing about Somaliland for the last few years. Brad, I forgot his name, and he said that here you have a people's project. Somaliland is a people's project, which means that, of course, the level of participation of the people in the running of the country is very high, and no government can make any decision without consulting, the Somaliland, population. Well, as also has been stated, the present government, since 1991, not only we developed a democratic system, which is a model, for the rest of Africa in this region, but all along we have also rebuilt, the social services, especially education, health, services, and water systems. And to conclude, my statement, I would really like again, to thank you so much for participating, in this event, and we hope, the results, at the end will be good. Thanks so much. Yes. Eventually, at last, I want to, after saying that, I want to introduce, Mr. Mohammed Bihi Yunus, the foreign minister, to deliver his statement.
Thank you very much, Mahmoud, and let me also thank Michael for an eloquent statement showing that Somaliland is legally a state, and thank you very much. I think it was really excellent. But maybe before I start my statement, I would also like to share with you a personal experience on the events that took place in Somaliland. I was actually with the African Development Bank in 1988, and I was told my father and my whole family were displaced, and they were in that refugee camp. So I flew from West Africa, Abidjan, the Ivory Coast, to Addis, and then took another flight to Durdaba. And I took a vehicle from the African Development Bank projects in Ethiopia to look for my parents and for my father and grandmother and my cousins and my family members. Actually, I went there in '88, as soon as they all left Somaliland, and I went there to look for my own father. And of course, he was an elderly man, late 70s, sick, and he ended up walking from Hargeisa to that place together with my stepmother, my grandmother, my cousins, and all my family members. And actually, I landed in that place, and I knew almost everybody who was in there because I came from that city. And as if I came into Hargeisa, but in a refugee camp. I went and I saw some of my relatives. In fact, my first cousin who came from Kuwait, who was visiting at the time with his kids, and he was all having sharp wounds in his body and having a lot of blood, and I actually died while I was there. And his last words were, "Can you please take care of my kids? I don't think I was gonna live long." And I think the experience that I have seen in that place at the time was horrifying. I could not believe that the government would bombard its own city, as Dr. Andrew was saying, take off from Hargeisa airport and start killing people in the same city. And those who were the pilots and others were being compensated heavily for the number of killings that they actually made. So this was my whole literal experience, but I still have a clear memory of what I have seen in that place, and it's really horrifying. It was very sad, and I really felt bad coming from the African Development Bank at the time. And these pictures actually brought a lot of memories back to my mind to see what has happened to the people of Somaliland during that time. But let me make my statement and first thank those of you who have organized this event. I think Somaliland as a whole are very grateful for your support. I want to thank the members of the Parliament. I want to thank the Honourable Nigel Farage, President of the United Kingdom Independence Party, James Craver and his colleagues for hosting this conference. I'm very glad also to have this opportunity to address members of the European Parliament about Somaliland's achievements and aspirations. And I would also like to thank the Member States and the EU institutions for the development assistance which Somaliland is receiving. The people of Somaliland are deeply grateful for your support. I would also like to focus today on three areas: Somaliland's re-emergence as an independent state, the case for recognizing Somaliland's independence, which was mainly done by Michael, so I won't go into depth into that issue, and our wish to see development assistance routed through the Somaliland Development Fund, of course an area that Dr. Saad will lately discuss. I would also like to talk about the relation with Somalia and our contribution to the international efforts to combat terrorism and piracy in the Horn of Africa. I would like to begin by recalling the recent history of my country. I think most of you have heard it from Michael and others. But as you might all know, Somaliland was a former British protectorate from 1884 to 1960, and it became an independent state. As Michael mentioned, 5 days later, we joined our group. So I won't actually go into the details of that because I think Michael has covered the 5 days experience that we have been an independent state and the number of member states that recognized Somaliland at that time, the General Assembly and the United Nations. But unfortunately and sadly, that proved to be a disastrous decision for my own people. Almost immediately, the people of Somaliland were excluded from the decision-making and the representative governments in the new Republic of Somalia. In turn, my people rejected the Somaliland Republic's constitution by referendum. And this union that has been created at the time actually brought a lot of isolation to our own people. I think in 1961, the Somaliland Army cadets, most of them actually trained in SAMES, a couple other military institutions here in the UK, staged a coup that was aborted, which highlights that within a matter of months, many have already disgruntled with the Union and with the Italian Somalia. In fact, those young cadets realizing that we're getting eroded, and they have actually started having their own coup right from the beginning. I said, assuming the power, of course, Somaliland, Siad Barre came into power, and of course, as has been said before, close to maybe from 50,000 to 100,000 people, civilians were displaced and killed. And almost close to 1 million, as Edna was saying, were displaced as refugees. But following the collapse of that state in 1992, the people of Somalia decided to withdraw from their voluntary union and reassert Somaliland's sovereignty and independence. The clan leaders and the elders of Somali national movement accordingly declared independence on 18 May 1991. In the meantime, many people built peace in their country through a bottom-up process, drawing on traditional conflict resolution methods. I think it's a process of all, you know, the process we have used actually works. In fact, my previous experience was mainly working in the area of conflict resolution in the Middle East and Gaza, Jerusalem, and Darfur. And quite a good number of the people that I have been dealing with actually felt that the method that we have used, the traditional method, the indigenous method that we have used, is probably one of the best that we have actually done. I think that process was purely indigenous and involved up to 37 reconciliation conferences, which have actually worked. A referendum was held on 31st May 2001. The people of Somaliland endorsed a new constitution and confirmed their desire to maintain Somaliland's independence. Somaliland held a multi-party municipal elections in 2002, parliamentary elections in 2005, and two presidential elections in 2003 and 2010, the last of which involved a peaceful transfer of power between political parties. International monitors have witnessed all of Somaliland's elections since 2003 and pronounced them to be free and fair. By all counts, we have one of the best democratic records in Africa, and I think, even though we are not yet recognized it, we believe that Somalia has done really well when it comes to managing its own resources. Coming back again to the way that we have managed it to help and build our own nation, we have built ourselves chiefly with the finance from the diaspora. We now have more than 400,000 students in primary schools and secondary schools, 16 universities, and at least one health post in almost every district. Government revenues have increased as a result, and we have been able to introduce free primary education for both boys and girls, which is a major step forward. We have also established a social bank. However, despite these significant achievements, many challenges remain, but we have an ambitious 5-year national development plan which has been shared with the donors. Somaliland enjoys a strong case for recognition. I don't think I'll go back into that because I think Michael has eloquently articulated that issue under the international law, and I think he has given a clear explanation of what has happened and the fact that we also meet all of the requirements of the statehood, and I think the fact that that union was never endorsed. But in Africa as a whole, as he also said, there is other parts of the world that have a lot of problems. I think there is a nervousness about changing existing borders. And I think Michael has also mentioned that issue, that many borders are purely arbitrary and were drawn to meet the interests of the European colonizers, not the indigenous inhabitants. In some cases, ethnic groups are split, leaving significant minorities on different sides of the international border. The international community worried that allowing change in one country, particularly in Africa, could create a ripple effect, which could result in other regions trying to succeed. But I think Somaliland's case is very different, as has been said. And of course, we have been an independent state, so I think those borders and the fact that Somaliland has an independent really doesn't have any problems with us. I think in Somaliland, I would also say that the Somaliland people have also made a repeated occasion, including in 2001 May, a referendum where 97% of the population voted in favor of Somaliland being recognized as an independent state. The Republic of Somaliland, the democracy, this desire has also been evidenced by their support in elections for parties supporting independence. My government cannot ignore the stated wishes of its own people. There is a democratic consensus in favor of independence. I think Michael has actually articulated that issue extremely well. But the international community has not taken into account those factors as it seeks to re-establish Somalia on the basis of the borders which existed from July 1960 to May 1991. The provisional constitution lays claim to Somaliland, and Somaliland has listed the coordinates of an executive economic zone, which includes the waters adjacent to Somaliland coast. Somaliland unequivocally rejects these claims to our territory and waters. While we endorse the need to stabilize Somalia, we believe that trying to re-establish it on the basis of the borders which existed for just 31 years is an act of folly and has the potential to stoke conflict. After all, if you do basic mathematics, the British Protectorate of Somaliland existed for 76 years before the formation of the Somali Republic. Combining the years that Somaliland was with the British Protectorate and its reassertion of the independence from Somalia, it has functioned as a separate state to Somalia for over a century, whereas Somalia has been lawless for longer than it has functioned as a stable nation. So we know that the vision of a greater Somalia does not work, so why insist of trying to recreate it again? We request the international community to support the two states of Somaliland and Somalia, living in peace side by side. Somaliland has the ability and the experience to also help Somalia solve its own problems when Somaliland is recognized. The re-establishment of a new Somali Republic will not succeed. We call on the international community and the EU member states as one of the leading players to acknowledge the reality on the ground. It's time to accept that the union between Somaliland and Somalia is integrated in 1991. And for my people, we have learned from our mistakes, which means that there's no going back to that failed union. The reason why Somaliland works as a state is because it's built its own internal peace from the bottom up and has inclusive democratic institutions based on universal suffrage. Somaliland has made tremendous progress for the last 25 years, and as an independent state, it's time to recognize the independence of Somaliland. The European Parliament has an important role to play in encouraging the international community to take a fresh look at this issue. If the outside world continues to resist new thinking, it may miss an important opportunity to stabilize the Horn of Africa in the long term. A Somaliland that was internationally recognized would be able to attract more foreign direct investment and receive loans from international financial institutions, which is currently bad. Such increased financial flows would create jobs and lead to increased government revenues, allowing it to deliver better services to the people of Somaliland. Reduced unemployment, especially among young people, would diminish the attractiveness of terrorism and extremism. Stronger government revenues will allow Somaliland to improve its security forces and so become an even more effective partner in combating extremism and differing piracy. Greater prosperity will also reinforce our democracy and allow us to act as even a better example to other countries, including not least Somalia, but about how it's possible to build peace and democracy from the grassroots. I wish also like to say a few words on our relationship with Somalia. I will say our relationship with Somalia, for obvious reasons, we feel a special sense of empathy for the sufferings which the Somali people have endured, and we welcome the progress which has been made by Amazon in driving Al-Shabaab out of the towns and cities it formerly dominated. We also thank the European Union and others for supporting that initiative. We look forward to a time when peace can be restored to Somalia as a whole. Its people deserve nothing less. Of course, we have our own political differences with the government in Mogadishu, but we seek to resolve those through negotiations and dialogue. In particular, we began Somaliland-Somalia dialogue in June 2012, which aimed at clarifying the relationship between the two countries. Turkey has generously facilitated this process, and it has given Somaliland and Somalia a platform to discuss their own differences. At a meeting between the President of Somaliland, President Ahmed Mohamed Silayu, and the President of Somalia, Hassan Sheikh Mohamud, in Djibouti on 21st December 2014, a month ago, we agreed to continue those talks and committed to resolve our own issues in a harmonious manner. And we have agreed to resolve our discussions through dialogue that would lead to separation and to a two-state solution. We have asked the President of Djibouti, Ismail Omar Guelleh, to kindly host the meeting, and his country is willing to be involved in the talks when needed. What we would like to see is more explicit support from the dialogue, from the EU. The EU was represented at the first round of talks in Jennings House, but not since. The dialogue provides a unique opportunity to secure an agreement on Somaliland status by peaceful means, and we hope that our friends in the EU will be willing to become more involved. We are also making the same appeal to the UN, to IGAD, and to the EU. But we do believe that the EU, given this statute, would be an ideal institution to get involved in the talks between Somalia and Somaliland. I can reassure Somalia that an independent Somaliland will be a good neighbor, ready to cooperate in promoting the peace and prosperity of both of our peoples in the Horn of Africa. It's also important to keep in mind that Somalia has been the most failed state in the world for a number of years. And there have been a lot of tragedies in South Sudan in the last couple of years also. Does the international community really want Somaliland to become like those states? No. We do believe Somaliland should be supported to maintain its stability, its peace, its democracy, and to be a member of the international community. On the issue of the security, Somaliland collaborates actively in the fight against terrorism, piracy, and extremism in the Horn of Africa. We spend a large part of our government budget, up to 52% actually, on security. We work with other countries in the region and the wider international community to exchange information about known terrorists. We are all aware that terrorism emanating from our region could also mean in the streets and transport networks of the European cities. We do believe that we spend a lot of time and effort to ensure that peace and stability within the region stays. The incidence of piracy off the coast of Somalia has fortunately decreased in the past 2 years. Somaliland has played a crucial role in international efforts to combat terrorism, piracy, and extremism. It has participated in the international contact group on piracy off the coast of Somalia, as well as the Kampala process. Hargeisa plays a host, Somaliland, Hargeisa, plays a host to an office of EU Cab Nesta, which concerns in improving the regional maritime capacity. The prison in Hargeisa was refurbished in 2012 to allow us to house pirate prisoners. We have agreed to accept certain types of convicted pirate prisoners from Seychelles and passed a new anti-piracy law in 2012 to permit this. Given more international assistance, we could do more to help. In particular, our Coast Guard has few serviceable boats to patrol a coastline which is 850 kilometers long. I hope that this conference will recognize both what we are doing to help and what our needs are. And I hope that the EU will support our initiative of combating piracy, and I hope they will provide a lot of support to our Coast Guard. The assistance that we receive from the EU the international community and the people of Somaliland have a long tradition of working successfully together across all sectors. We are especially grateful to the EU for the support which it provides. The EU is the largest donor in Somaliland and has been a long-standing friend of my country. It was the first to establish an office in Somaliland and was soon followed by its member states, Denmark and the UK, and we would like to encourage more member states to follow suit. In September 2012, here in Brussels, the EU agreed the Somaliland Special Arrangement, which is a separate and a distinct part of the Somali Compact within the framework of the New Deal of Fragile States. What the SSA, the Somaliland Special Arrangement, has done is to strengthen the way we work together with the elected government in the lead, and a stronger spirit of partnership and coordination with other doers. My colleague, of course, Dr. Saad, will provide more information on the issue and on the national planning development issues. My government preferred financing mechanism, of course. I should also mention, I think, nonetheless, the EU support Somaliland also continues this work to support and try to reduce the number of youth unemployment. We also try to combat gender and sexual-based violence, including FGM. My government's preferred financing mechanism for the Somaliland Special Arrangement is the Somaliland Development Fund, originally set by the UK and Denmark, to whom we are grateful. I'm glad to report that Norway and the Netherlands have now started to support the fund. We are committed to making this a success story. The EU aims to join the fund in 2015. We need to ensure that the bureaucratic process do not slow this process. And we need your support to ensure that the EU actually joins that fund. The fund has already started having an impact in terms of building the capacity of the state. Important projects such as the Leferu Road have now started. I would also like to invite the international partners, and especially the EU, to join the fund and establish other mechanisms that model the Somaliland Development Fund. The Somaliland Development Fund illustrates how the New Deal can make a difference. I think in conclusion, I would like once again to thank the team who have invited us. I would also like to say that Somaliland is a very peaceful, democratic, and a nation that's very free against terrorism, a very moderate Muslim Sunni state, as you have already said, Jim. And Somaliland, I think, is ready to be part of the international world. A Somaliland that was recognized internationally could do more to help stabilize the Horn of Africa. Somaliland is in part the product of the European colonization. I appeal to the European Parliament to help the people of Somaliland to achieve their ambition to secure their rightful place in the international community and to support its own independence. Once again, I would like to thank you all for listening to me, and thank you for inviting us. And hopefully, we hope that EU will do much more in the future for Somaliland than what you have done now. Thanks so much.
Okay, we can have a 15-minute break, after which Dr. Saad will come forward and give a general view of the situation. Dr. Saad is the Somaliland Minister of Planning. So we'll have a 15-minute break, then Dr. Saad, then we'll break for lunch, and then obviously we'll be back over. I'd need to check the venue for this afternoon. I understand we're moving over to one of the rooms in the European Parliament, but I'll announce that later. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
waxaa shirkaasi ballaaran uu ka socday dalka Brussels gaar ahaan magaalada Belgium oo magaalada Brussels ayuu shirkaasi ka socday waxaana uu ahaa shir lagaga hadlayay qadiyada iyo go'aansutaaga dalka Jamhuuriyadda Somaliland waan arkayseen baarlamaankii dalka Ingiriiska oo halkaasi iyagu soo qabanqaabiyay arrintaasi oo halkaasi ka hadlayay iyo waliba wasiiradeena oo halkaasi joogay oo imika hadda dhameeyay wasiirka arrimaha dibadda ee dalka Jamhuuriyadda Somaliland mudane maxamuud biixi yunis oo farqeen arinta uu ka hadlayay qadiyada Somaliland oo ahayd mid aad iyo aad uga waramay taariikhdii Somaliland isla markaana Yurubiyanka uu soo bandhigay in ay Somaliland ay tahay meel xasiloon oo ku taala geeska Afrika oo nabad leh oo waliba leh election aad iyo aad u wanaagsan oo ay doorteen madaxweyne si dimuqraadiya lagu soo doortay oo magaciisa la yiraahdo Axmed Maxamed Maxamuud Silaanyo ayuu halkaas ka jeediyay waxa iyaguna hadda imika la galay qadar yar oo brief waxa halkan isaguna taagan oo isna dhow hadli doona wasiirka qorsheynta ee dalka Jamhuuriyadda Somaliland mudane Saad Ali Shire oo halkan jooga iyo waliba adna آدم إسماعيل أو يدنا وزيركي هراء أرمها دبته دلك جمهورية سوماليلاند أو يدنا كاسيكا لدوتا يو لبا بارلمانكا يوروبيانكا أو يجونا كاسيكا لدونا يجوا أسوقاتي إن كهلن قضية سوماليلاند ويكجو أنت هاي غير يوروب إن أي سوماليلاند أي تاجران قد يدودنا ستة أي كهلن دايس مع الحجادن تلفزيون كقرية جمهورية سوماليلاند بروسلس وانا راليك هذا قدر دبديدا ايان كسون نقون دونا انتن هودا مر لبا دب كل مid doono waa daaris maxal caadin oo idinka tagaya saasiyo nabadgeliyo waa Belgium iyo soo noqon wanaagsan